Hi, I'm Ross Reichart from MBS. Let's talk about the mvWorkstation. Well, the mvWorkstation is a D3 client that allows access to local computing resources such as local files, local printers, and can even set up a telnet server on a local workstation computer. It'd be well suited to situations where people were working from home, or in the case of a satellite office to a corporate head office, where people working needed to have access to a central D3 application or D3 server, but needed to also access those local resources such as files, printers, and so on. The workstation itself came from the MV base product, where it's been a feature for many, many years, and D3 10.3.1 represents a transition for MV base customers onto the D3 product set. And so to enable those MV base customers to make that transition, Rocket Software needed to migrate the mvWorkstation onto D3. But my interest today is actually more what the mvWorkstation can bring to existing D3 customers. So we'll look at how to set up a telnet server on it, we'll look how to configure a printer, and we'll talk a little bit about the networking issues involved, given that the workstation will be running on a workstation computer, which is a separate machine and quite possibly in a separate location to the main D3 server. There will be some networking issues and probably firewall issues involved, so we'll have a brief look at that. Okay, the first thing we'll talk about is the installation of the mvWorkstation. And it's worth noting at this point that the installation process will all be done on a Windows machine because the mvWorkstation itself is a Windows-only component. It will work with D3 Server running on any of the supported platforms for D3, but the workstation itself is Windows only. So I have mine running on a plain installation of Windows 10, and actually I've got the workstation installed already. So my installation steps here, I'll just cut short, and they won't be for a fresh install, they are for an existing installation. So we can see here that I have the installation process stopped at the step where we choose what we want to do with the installation. And in this case, I'm being offered the modify, repair, or remove steps because I have it installed already, other than the install, repair, or remove steps. So I choose modify, I step in with the wizard, and here we do a custom setup. So we can see if I unfold my servers node that I have none of the D3 servers selected for installation. That's because this is the mvWorkstation machine, this is not the D3 server machine. If I now install the clients node, you can see that of the list of clients available for installation, the only one I have selected or available for installation is the mvWorkstation right here. And that's how we would go about and install mvWorkstation. If I step through from here, we get the normal wizard steps for installing D3. I won't proceed with them because I don't want to reinstall, but we'd step through the normal installation steps, and at the end of the installation process, we'd have the mvWorkstation installed on our client machine. I'll just cancel out of the installation here now. Okay. The next thing we want to look at is how we actually administer the mvWorkstation. And this is a pretty big and interesting topic. It's all done through our old friend, for those of us who know D3 on Windows, that is, the device manager. The device manager has been a feature of D3 on Windows since the product was first released. And it does allow us, it's the central administration piece for administering a D3 installation. For the mvWorkstation, Rocket Software have added a workstation tab here to the device manager. And if we click the workstation tab, the first thing we're shown is a run as box where we can see the status of the mvWorkstation running either as an application or as a service, and it can run as both. You can see on mine both of them are stopped, so it's not running at all on my machine at the moment, but this is how you choose to start it either as a service or as an application. To set it up though, we choose the configure button. And that takes us into another box with a few tabs. We can see ports, printers, telnet servers, and MV server endpoints. Today I'm only interested in the printers or telnet servers tab, so they're the ones we'll be dealing with. And let's talk about a telnet server first. So I'll select the telnet servers tab. You can see that we have no telnet servers currently available. Now what we're doing here is actually using the mvWorkstation to configure a local telnet server on the machine that the mvWorkstation is running on. So in this case, it's our client machine. It's not the D3 server machine, it's our client machine. So we're running, if you like, a remote telnet server. Now this could be a useful thing in a satellite office where you don't want to send telnet communications down a VPN or any other sort of network connection that you might have to your central office. You want to keep those telnet connections and communications local. Well, you can do that with mvWorkstation because we can set up this local telnet server. In order to do that, we click the Add button here, and there are a few options to set up. The first one is, what's the name of the MV telnet server? That's really only used for when we're modifying it. We can set up a number of telnet servers if we need to, and so just to distinguish one from the other, we can give it a name. So I'm just going to call it local telnet. Now we have the name of the D3 server that it's going to communicate to. I have mine set up just to be D3 server. That's the name I've given the D3 server that I'll be communicating to. The TCP port number that the telnet server will be listening on defaults to the standard port number of 23, but you can change it to another port number if that suits you better. Then we have two boxes here, one for the starting line and one for the maximum number of connections. Now these are interesting. You can choose here which D3 PIB or port or line or what terminology you want to call it, which D3 port that you want to have the telnet server listen for or connect to first. So your connection will be connected to that particular PIB number on the D3 server. I'm going to start at 31. And then you can say the maximum number of connections that this telnet server will support. Well, I'm just going to choose 5. A couple of other interesting options below that. We have a tick box that says 1 telnet server per line and another one that says the number of servers. So if we choose 1 server per line, that allied with the number of servers will set up a number of individual telnet servers, each of which will allow 1 connection for a line. So each telnet server will support just 1 connection, and it will go to a particular line dictated by the starting line we've set up here. So if I tick that option, you can see that the maximum number of connections now has grayed out. I can't adjust that, but I can adjust the number of servers. If I was to OK on that, it would actually configure for me, in this case, 5 discrete telnet servers starting at line 31 and working their way down. And each one of those 5 discrete telnet servers would support 1 connection, taking up 1 D3 line. And each of those servers can be run individually, started and stopped individually. I'm not going to do that in this case, so we'll back out of that option. Put that back to 1, we'll re-enable that, and I'll put my maximum number of connections to 5. And there's a few options down here, just how you would prefer your preferences for configuring, including we can set up a custom startup string. You'll see when we connect to it a bit later on that when you connect to this telnet server, there is a custom string comes up on or there is a welcome string comes up on the telnet connection, and this is where we can modify that. Interoperability over here refers to either remote or local client. Now those remote and local terms are relative to this particular telnet server, or in actual fact the mvWorkstation machine that we're working on. So a remote client would be a machine that is not this machine connecting to this machine. A local client would be this machine, and we can see a few options there of things that we can set up. What we can not do on a remote client that we can do on a local client is the uexecute command, which allows us to execute commands local to that machine through a basic program, and also have access to the Windows clipboard. Those two functions are only available if we're connecting with a local client or a client local to this mvWorkstation machine, and not a remote client. Okay, once we're happy with the telnet server, then we click the OK button, and we see that the telnet server there is listed in our list of available telnet servers. Now let's set up a printer now. Very similar process for setting up printers. We go to the Printers tab, we choose the Add button, and there's a few options here. So again, we give it a printer name, which is really only relative or relevant for our local setup here, so we can distinguish one printer from another. So I'm just going to call it local printer. I'm only going to set up the one today. Now we choose which printer we want to print to, and this is a list of printers that are local to the mvWorkstation computer, and they must have been set up before we go and do this configuration. There's another interesting point there. This configuration must be done before you start the mvWorkstation, and the mvWorkstation must be started after the D3 server is started. So I choose my printer there, and again, what D3 server am I wanting to, oops, go back and re-choose my printer and move into the correct box. Yes, which D3 server do I want to connect to? And again, the name of mine is simply D3 server. What line do I want to connect to? I connect to line 201. And what driver type? If I choose Windows GDI, then standard things like block print or list with a printing option or whatever will print on my printer. I don't want to disable the printer, so I'll leave the disable box unticked and I choose OK. And there we have our printer now listed in the list of available printers. So to recap, we've set up a telnet server, we've called it local telnet. We've set up a printer, we've called it local printer. They both connect to my D3 server. So when we start up the D3 server and then start up the workstation after it, we should see that we have available a printer that we can connect to, that will in fact be our local printer, and we have a telnet server and we can connect to that local telnet server too. So I'm done here. I'll close out there and I'll close out the device manager, and we can move on to actually starting it and running it next. So let's move on to that phase. Okay, now that we have mvWorkstation configured correctly, let's start it and see what we can do with it. But before we do, we'll talk briefly about the communications between mvWorkstation and D3 server. mvWorkstation communicates with D3 using TCP/IP, and given that mvWorkstation and D3 server might be located in different physical locations, there's quite likely to be some form of a firewall between them. If we don't configure that firewall correctly, then mvWorkstation won't be able to connect to D3, and it just simply won't work as we'd hoped. To configure the firewall correctly, we need to open up port 1718 to allow the messages from mvWorkstation to pass through the firewall and connect successfully to D3. Now I have that rule set up on the firewall in my lab here, so I know that the mvWorkstation machine will connect to D3, and we'll be able to demonstrate what we can do. So let's start it up now and see what we can actually do with it. Back on my client machine here now, you can see that I've got the device manager open and it's running at the workstation tab. And we can see in that tab that we've got the workstation application and the workstation service both listed. Now the workstation can be started up either as an application or as a service on your Windows machine. I'm going to start it as a service today, so I just simply select the workstation entry in the list and click the Start button. Straight away you can see that the status here on the workstation tab changes to running, indicating that the workstation is running. And there's a way we can show that also when we get into D3. So let's see if we can now connect to it. I've got a Wintegrate session here, and I'll just configure it so we can telnet to my local machine. Why the local machine? Well, I'm working here at my mvWorkstation computer, and if you remember back to when we configured it, I configured an MV telnet server hosted by mvWorkstation. So I am in fact connecting to my local host, connecting to the MV telnet server hosted by mvWorkstation. If I look in the Advanced tab, you can see that I've got telnet selected and port 23. So if I OK on both of those, immediately you can see that I've got a welcome message telling me that I'm connected to line 31 on D3 server. Why line 31? Well, again, back to the configuration. When I set up the MV telnet server as part of the mvWorkstation configuration, I set it up for a maximum of 5 lines starting at D3 line number 31. Now this is the first connection to the MV telnet server that I've made, and so it's just allocated me to line 31. Again, back to the configuration, I named the D3 server simply D3 server. So that's why it's saying I'm connected to line 31 on D3 server. So now I'll log into D3. And the first thing I'll do here is a dev list. And when I do a dev list, you can see at the bottom of the list that I've got a telnet connection on port 31. That's an asterisk beside it shows me that that's the current line that I'm on. And I've also got a printer connection at line 201. You'll see in the device type column that both of those are tagged as WStation or Workstation, indicating that they are actually Workstation connections. Fine, well we can see that the telnet server clearly works. What about the printer? So we'll just create a D3 printer here with a start printer command, and I'll attach it to line 201, which is my printer line. We can see that the control block's been initialized. So my printer should work now. Let's try that out. I'll just simply do a list users and I'll bracket P to print it out. And now that will take a bit of time to get through to my printer. My printer's warming up now, you might hear it in the background, and in just a moment that listing of users will pop out on my printer. So we'll give my printer just a moment, it's just printing now. And here we have it, a listing of the users produced by the printer connected to mvWorkstation. So that's a very brief demonstration of firstly the MV Telnet server and also using a local printer off mvWorkstation. So that was just a brief introduction to the mvWorkstation. We talked about it being a client to D3 server and how it might be very well suited to a working from home situation or a remote satellite office. mvWorkstation, as we saw, can provide a local telnet server for those connections that need to use D3, but you don't want to forward them across the internet to your centrally located D3 server. mvWorkstation can handle those well. We also saw how it's able to use a local printer, so we can direct printouts to a printer that's actually local to the machine that we're working on. What we didn't talk about and didn't demonstrate, but is certainly possible with a workstation, is also access to local files. So it would be possible, again in that satellite or home office, to make a connection, a telnet connection locally that connects to D3, have printouts come out locally, and also save files locally, dump data out and save those files locally. That's all possible through the mvWorkstation. mvWorkstation is available now on D3 10.3.1, and as I said in my introduction, it was originally part of the mvBase product, so it's certainly there available for mvBase customers who want to migrate across to D3. So thanks very much for your time. Appreciate you watching my video. If there's any other subjects that you'd like me to talk about, please let me know. I'll put my email address up in just a moment. Or if you have any questions about mvWorkstation, please let me know. I'd love to engage in a conversation with you about it. Okay, thanks again, and bye for now.